At my father's dinner table, he mocked my husband for being poor, while my 5-year-old son listened. My sister laughed, and my mother said nothing. Then Dad told me to leave and never come back for Thanksgiving because they were happier without me. I picked up my son, turned around, and said 5 words. 4 days after my father told me not to come back for Thanksgiving, a woman named Carol Whitfield called my husband's cell phone at 6:14 a.m., crying so hard he could barely make out her name. I was standing in the kitchen in yesterday's t-shirt, pouring cereal for Noah, when I heard Daniel say, "Whoa, hey, slow down," in the voice he uses for customers who just found out their transmission is worth more than their car. He walked into the hallway. I heard Westerville Road and my grandmother, and he told her what, and then nothing for almost a full minute except him saying, "Okay," over and over, low and careful, like he was talking someone off a ledge. When he came back into the kitchen, his face had gone the color of old drywall. "That was Frank Whitfield's granddaughter," he said. I didn't recognize the name at first. Then I did, and my stomach dropped before my brain caught up, the way it does when you're driving and the car in front of you brakes, and you know you're going to hit it before you've even taken your foot off the gas. Frank Whitfield taught my husband how to rebuild an engine when Daniel was 15 years old and skipping study hall to hang around Frank's garage on Cleveland Avenue because it was warmer than his apartment and quieter than his house. Frank never had kids of his own. He gave Daniel his first real toolbox, a 1987 Craftsman set that still lives in a drawer in our garage, and he told him, more than once, that a man's word was the only tool that never rusted. Frank died 6 years ago. His widow, Eleanor, is 78. She still owns the 14-bay lot on Westerville Road that Frank built with his own hands over 30 years, the same lot my father had spent 2 Thanksgivings bragging he was about to buy. I hadn't put those two facts next to each other until that morning. I don't think I'd wanted to. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what that property actually is. It isn't just dirt and a building. It's the closest thing Daniel has to a family inheritance, even though nobody left it to him. He'd worked there summers as a teenager, and after Frank passed, Eleanor kept the place running through a manager for a few years, mostly out of stubbornness and grief, before she finally admitted to her granddaughter that it had become too much. Word got around the trade that it might sell. My father heard about it at a Rotary Club lunch 8 months ago, and from that day forward, he treated the deal like it was already signed, sealed, and mounted on his office wall next to his logistics company's first truck title. My father runs Coleman Freight and Logistics, 41 trucks and a warehouse off I-270 that he built from 6 trucks and a loan his own father co-signed in 1994. He is, by every metric he uses to measure people, successful. He is also, and I only started to understand how deeply that fall, running out of runway. Coleman Freight had lost its biggest client that spring, a regional grocery distributor that made up almost a third of his revenue, to a competitor with newer trucks and better rates. He needed a second terminal to bid on a replacement contract with a company called Midwest Distribution Partners, and the bid deadline was in 6 weeks. The Westerville Road lot, with its 14 bays and its highway access, was exactly what he needed. He just needed Eleanor Whitfield to sign. I didn't know any of that yet. Standing in my kitchen at 6:20 in the morning with cereal going soft in Noah's bowl, what I knew was that Carol Whitfield was crying, and that Daniel's face looked like he'd swallowed something jagged. What I did know, because I'd lived it beside him for 9 years, was what it had cost Daniel to become someone worth Frank Whitfield's trust in the first place. He'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dayton with a mother who worked doubles at a diner, and by 17 he was the one making sure the lights stayed on some months. He never finished the associate's degree he started at the community college, not because he couldn't, but because the shop that hired him for weekend hours offered him full-time work instead, and full-time work paid the light bill in a way that credits toward a diploma didn't. He'd built Miller Automotive's reputation one honest estimate at a time, the kind of mechanic who tells you your brakes have another 6 months in them instead of upselling you a job you don't need yet, and it had taken him 12 years to get from sweeping floors to owning the place outright. My father had looked at all of that across a dinner table and seen only the grease under his nails. "She wants to talk to us," he said, "today, before anything else happens." I called my sitter, dropped Noah at daycare 20 minutes late, and by 9 a.m., Daniel and I were sitting in Eleanor Whitfield's living room on a couch with plastic still on the cushions, looking at a stack of papers Carol had spread across the coffee table like evidence at a trial, which, in a way, it was. Eleanor sat in a recliner with an Afghan over her knees, and she looked smaller than I remembered her from Frank's funeral, the kind of small that isn't really about size. Carol did most of the talking. She was maybe 35, a nurse, the kind of person who reads everything twice before she signs it, and she'd found the purchase agreement in her grandmother's junk drawer while looking for a spare house key. He told her the market was about to crash. Carol said. He told her commercial real estate in this corridor was going to lose 40% of its value by spring, and that he was doing her a favor getting her out before it happened. I told myself, right there on that plastic-covered couch, that there had to be a version of this where my father wasn't lying, where he genuinely believed what he was saying, where it was aggressive but not dishonest, where this was just Richard Coleman being Richard Coleman, a man who has never once in his life undersold his own generosity. Then Carol slid the appraisal across the table. Tom Nguyen, a certified appraiser Daniel's attorney would later hire independently, would eventually put the fair market value of the Westerville Road property at $612,000. The number sitting in front of me that morning, in my father's own handwriting on the purchase agreement Eleanor had already signed, was $340,000. My hands went cold holding that piece of paper, not shaking yet, just cold, the way they get right before they start. She signed it 3 weeks ago, Carol said. He came by twice a week for 2 months first, brought her groceries, fixed her mailbox, told her Frank would want her taken care of. Her voice cracked on that last part. And then he told her interest rates were about to make everyone's offer disappear, and she needed to sign that week or lose the chance to sell it all. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because the truth isn't flattering. Part of me, a small, ugly 8 years of practice part of me, wanted to defend him, wanted to say maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe the contract has language nobody's reading right, maybe there's a version of my father that isn't this. I had spent my whole life building elaborate detours around the plainest evidence of who he was. That instinct doesn't die just because you finally start walking away from the table. Daniel didn't have that instinct. He'd never had 8 years of practice not seeing my father clearly. We need a lawyer, he said, today. Karen Blackwood had handled the purchase agreement on Daniel's side of the deal already, a real estate attorney with 14 years in commercial transactions, the kind of woman who answers emails at 10 p.m. and never once makes you feel stupid for asking a question twice. When Daniel called her that afternoon and explained what we'd found, she went quiet for a second, and then she said the sentence that turned this from a family humiliation into something with an actual legal shape. If she can show the offer was pushed through under pressure, with a false sense of urgency from someone in a position of trust. That's not just a bad deal, Emily. Depending on how it's documented, that starts looking like undue influence, possibly elder financial exploitation. That's a different conversation with a different set of people. I asked her what that meant in practice. It means, Karen said, your father may have just handed us the exact thing that gets his own contract thrown out. That night, I lay in bed and did the math on my father's ego, which I'd been doing my whole life without ever writing the equation down. He had bragged about this deal at 2 Thanksgivings. He had told his golf partners. He had, according to something Vanessa let slip weeks earlier that I hadn't understood the weight of at the time, already told his banker the lot was as good as his, was already drawing up expansion plans for the Midwest Distribution Partners bid. If that deal collapsed, if it turned out he'd secured it by lying to a grieving widow about a market crash that didn't exist, it wasn't going to be a quiet embarrassment. My father had never once in his life done anything quietly. I told myself that night that we would handle it carefully, fairly, that we'd let Eleanor make her own informed choice with real numbers in front of her, and whatever happened to my father after that would be a consequence of his own decisions, not something we engineered. I believed that. I still believe it's what we actually did. I did not yet understand how hard my father was going to fight to make sure it never got that far. The first sign came 6 days later, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, when David Chen called Daniel's cell phone instead of the shop line. David is a senior commercial loan officer at Heritage Community Bank, 9 years in, the kind of steady, unhurried voice you want on the other end of the phone when you're about to sign for a mortgage on a business property. He'd already pre-approved Daniel for financing on the Westerville Road purchase 2 weeks earlier, contingent on the appraisal and title work coming back clean. Now he was calling to tell Daniel that someone claiming to be a family friend had called the bank's main line that morning asking questions about the shop's financials, about whether Daniel had cash flow problems, about whether the loan committee knew Miller Automotive had changed ownership under strange circumstances. I didn't give out anything, David said. I can't and I wouldn't, but I wanted you to know somebody's asking. Daniel hung up and stood in the kitchen holding the phone like it had bitten him. He's trying to kill my loan, he said. It wasn't a question. I told myself, and I want to be honest that I actually said this out loud, to my own husband, 4 days before Thanksgiving, that my father wouldn't do that he was arrogant and cutting and cruel at a dinner table in a way that had scarred me since I was 9 years old, but that sabotaging his own daughter's family financially was a different that he was arrogant and cutting and cruel at a dinner table in a way that had scarred me since I was 9 years old, but that sabotaging his own daughter's family financially was a different category of person than the one I'd grown up with. David called back the following afternoon with more, this time because he felt he owed Daniel the courtesy of knowing exactly what he was up against. The caller had asked specifically whether a loan of that size to a single-location auto shop with under 2 years of ownership stability was standard practice, and whether the bank had verified Daniel's financials independently or simply taken his word for them. them. It was the kind of question designed to plant a seed in a loan committee's head without ever needing to be true. David told me later, once all of this was over, that he'd recognized the tactic immediately because he'd spent 9 years watching people try it. Somebody wanted us second-guessing ourselves right up until the wire deadline, he said. That's not a concerned citizen. That's a competing bidder. 2 days later, one of Miller Automotive's longest customers, a woman named Patricia Sung, who'd been bringing her Honda Accord to the shop for 6 years, called to cancel a scheduled brake job. She told the front desk, apologetically, that a man who introduced himself as a business associate of the shop had called her and mentioned, in a friendly, concerned way, that Miller Automotive was having some financial trouble, and she might want to find somewhere more stable. She didn't get a name. She got a voice that, when Daniel described the call back to me, sounded exactly like my father's phone manner. Warm, unhurried, devastating. That's when my hands actually started shaking, not metaphorically. I stood at our kitchen counter holding a dish towel, and my fingers wouldn't stop moving. Small tremors, like my body had understood something my mind was still refusing to fully accept, that my father was willing to burn down my husband's business. Quietly, one customer and one bank inquiry at a time, rather than let this deal slip out of his hands. I called him. I want to say I planned that call carefully, but I didn't. I stood in the garage where Daniel couldn't hear me, and I dialed my father's number for the first time since the night he told me not to come back for Thanksgiving. "Are you calling my husband's customers?" He didn't even pretend to be confused, which somehow made it worse than if he'd lied outright. "I'm protecting my business interests," he said. "You'll understand that when you're running something bigger than a garage. You're trying to destroy him. I'm making sure the right people end up with what they've earned." A pause, and then, in the same tone he'd used across that dinner table with Noah still chewing his food, "You should have thought about that before you let him get involved in something above his level." I hung up without saying anything else, because I knew if I stayed on that call another 30 seconds, I was going to say something I couldn't take back, and I wanted to save that for when it would actually matter. It mattered 4 days later, on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, when Carol Whitfield called again, not crying this time, but flat and scared in a way that frightened me more than the tears had. "He came by again," she said, "alone. Told my grandmother that Daniel was under investigation for fraud, and that if she went through with selling to him, she could be sued as an accessory. He told her the safest thing to do was sign an addendum extending the option period on his contract another 60 days, just to protect her. Eleanor, God bless her, hadn't signed it. She'd told Carol she wanted to sleep on it, which turned out to be the single bravest sentence in this entire story, because it bought us exactly enough time. Karen Blackwood didn't waste any of it. She looped in Patricia Alvarez, an elder law attorney she'd worked with before, who specializes almost entirely in cases exactly like this one: capacity, undue influence, and the particular vulnerability of people who are grieving, alone, and used to trusting the person standing in their kitchen with a bag of groceries. Patricia met with Eleanor and Carol that same afternoon, walked through the timeline, the appraisal gap, the market crash claim that had never been true, the 2 visits a week for 2 months before the signature, the fabricated fraud accusation against Daniel used to pressure a 60-day extension. By the end of the meeting, Patricia had a name for what she was looking at, and it wasn't a bad business deal. "This has the shape of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult," she told us over the phone that evening, her voice careful and clinical in the way professionals get when they're handling something they've seen too many times before. "I'd like to bring in adult protective services, not to punish anyone prematurely, to document. If we're wrong, the documentation protects your father. If we're right, it protects Eleanor." I remember thinking, even then, some small, stubborn part of me still hoping to be wrong. It protects Eleanor either way. It was my father the documentation was going to hurt. Denise Okafor called the next morning. 11 years with Franklin County Adult Protective Services. A voice like a hand on your shoulder. Firm, not soft, the kind of calm that comes from doing hard interviews for over a decade. She spent 2 hours with Eleanor that Monday, alone, no family in the room, the way these interviews are supposed to go so nobody can say afterward that anyone was coached. She asked about the groceries, about the mailbox, about the 60-day extension, and the word fraud my father had used about my husband, a man Eleanor had known since he was 15 years old, fixing carburetors under Frank's supervision. She opened a formal investigation that afternoon. I found out about the investigation from Karen, not from my father, which tells you something about how the next 3 days went. I found out he knew about it from Vanessa, who called me Tuesday night, 2 days before Thanksgiving, the anniversary of the dinner where he'd told me never to come back, and screamed at me for 45 minutes about ruining the family. "He's not a criminal," she said. "He made a good offer on a rundown lot from a sad old lady, and now you and your husband have the county investigating him like he's a predator. He told her the market was going to crash. He told her Daniel was under a fraud investigation. Neither of those things is true, Vanessa. You don't know that. I know the appraisal came back at $612,000, and his offer was $340. I know adult Adult Protective Services doesn't open a case because someone haggled hard on a real estate deal. There was a long silence, and in it, I heard something I hadn't expected. Not doubt about our facts, but fear about something else entirely. Brad's dealership is depending on that deal too, she said finally, quieter. Dad told him he could lease space there once he closed. If this falls apart, and there it was. My sister's fiancé, Bradley Ashford, had been counting on my father's lot to launch a used car dealership, which meant Vanessa wasn't defending our father out of love. She was defending the last domino before her own future toppled. I didn't say any of that to her. I just told her I was sorry it was going to be hard, and I meant it. And then I hung up, because I had learned somewhere in the last 2 weeks that I no longer needed her to understand before I could keep moving forward. My mother called an hour later. That call I wasn't ready for. Diane Coleman has said almost nothing critical of my father in the 31 years I've been alive. She said something that night. "He's scared, Emily," she said, and her voice had a texture I'd never heard in it before. Not defending him exactly, but not condemning him either. Just describing him, like a woman finally allowed to say a true sentence out loud after decades of practice keeping her mouth shut. Coleman Freight lost the grocery contract in the spring. He hasn't told anyone. He needs that Midwest bid in 6 weeks or he's going to have to lay off drivers he's had for 15 years. I think he convinced himself that if he just got the lot fast enough, none of the rest of it would matter. That doesn't make what he did to Eleanor okay. "I know," she said, and then, so quietly, I almost missed it. "I've known things weren't right with him for a while, and I didn't say anything either. That's my failure, not yours. I'm sorry, Em. I should have said something the night he told you not to come back. I should have said something 100 nights before that." It wasn't an apology big enough to undo 8 years of silence at that table, but it was the first true thing my mother had said to me in longer than I could remember, and I let myself feel that, even while everything else was still on fire. The closing was scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving, 10 a.m., at Heritage Title on Bethel Road. Eleanor, with Patricia Alvarez's guidance and a clean, fair offer from Daniel, full appraised value, $612,000, no games, no urgency, an inspection period, and everything else done exactly the way Frank would have wanted it done, had decided to sell to us instead. My father's 60-day extension addendum sat unsigned in a drawer. His original agreement, given the pressure and misrepresentation documented in Denise Okafor's ongoing investigation, was looking less and less like something any court would ever enforce. He had 1 day left to do something about it. He used it. I got the call from Carol at 4:50 on the Sunday afternoon before closing. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in front of an old woman who needed her to be steady. "He's here," she said. "He drove out and he's sitting in her living room right now telling her that if she goes through with tomorrow, he'll sue her for breach of contract, and that a lawsuit will eat every dollar she has left before she ever sees a dime from Daniel." I looked at the clock. It was almost 5. The closing was 15 hours away. Daniel called Karen Blackwood, who was at her sister's for the holiday weekend, and picked up on the second ring anyway, because that's the kind of lawyer she is. She told us, in a voice sharper than I'd heard from her before, that a breach of suit against Eleanor would go nowhere given the documentation Patricia and Denise already had. But that didn't matter tonight. What mattered was an 80-year-old woman sitting in her own living room being threatened with losing everything by a man she'd trusted for 30 years because he'd brought her casseroles. "Call Denise," Karen said. "Now, tonight. APS can respond to an active situation, not just investigate a closed one." I called Denise Okafor at 5:04 on a Sunday evening before a holiday weekend, fully expecting voicemail. She answered on the third ring. "Send me the address," she said. "I'm calling the sheriff's non-emergency line for a welfare check, and I'll meet them there." Daniel wanted to drive out there himself. I understood the instinct. Frank's chair was practically already sitting in the corner of his mind, but Karen was firm on the phone, her voice cutting through the static of our own panic. "If you show up, it becomes a shouting match between 2 men and a scared old woman in the middle. Let the people whose job this is do their job." So we sat in our kitchen instead, phones face up on the table between us, and waited the way you wait for test results, watching the clock hands crawl from 5:04 to 5:20 to 5:35, with nothing to do but refresh a phone screen that refused to change. Noah wandered in once, asked why Mommy's hands looked funny, and I told him I was just cold, and sent him back to his cartoons so he wouldn't watch me come apart over something he was too young to carry. I have never before or since sat through 51 minutes like the ones between that call and the text from Carol that finally came through. "He's gone." Deputies asked him to leave. "Grandma's shaking, but okay. Denise is here now." My hands didn't stop shaking until almost midnight. Denise's report from that visit, filed the next morning as an addendum to her open investigation, described a credible threat of legal and financial retaliation made to intimidate a vulnerable adult from proceeding with a legally arranged transaction, and recommended the county's Consumer Protection Division be looped in given what she called an apparent apparent pattern, because in the course of her interview that night, Eleanor mentioned something that changed the shape of everything. She wasn't the only one. There had been another elderly Coleman freight vendor 2 years earlier, a man named Harold Beyer, who'd leased warehouse space to my father's company, and, according to what Eleanor had heard secondhand at a church function, had been pressured into a below-market lease renewal using almost identical language about a market downturn that never happened. Denise flagged it. It went to the county's Consumer Protection Division the following week, and from there, because Franklin County isn't as big as people think, and the business community even smaller, it reached Marcus Webb, a reporter who'd covered logistics and commercial real estate for the Central Ohio Business Courier for 12 years, and had, it turned out, already been sniffing around Coleman Freight's finances after hearing rumors about the lost grocery contract. Marcus called Daniel on the Wednesday after closing, 3 days after Eleanor had signed the deed over to us at Heritage Title with Patricia Alvarez sitting beside her the entire time, and Denise Okafor's investigation formally closed with a substantiated finding. He wanted comment on a story he was already reporting, a pattern of pressured below-market acquisitions by Coleman Freight and Logistics, an open elder exploitation finding from Franklin County Adult Protective Services, and questions about whether the company's finances were as stable as my father had spent 2 decades telling everyone they were. Daniel gave him one quote, careful and factual. Nothing more than the truth would already show. We paid Mrs. Whitfield full fair market value with no pressure and no deadline. Everyone should be able to sell what they own without being lied to first. The story ran the following Tuesday under a headline I won't forget. Local logistics owner faces scrutiny over elderly vendor deals amid company's financial strain. It quoted the appraisal gap. It quoted Denise's substantiated finding, a matter of public record once the investigation closed. It mentioned Harold Beyer by name, because Harold, once he heard what had happened to Eleanor, decided he was done being quiet about his own lease too. I won't pretend I felt clean satisfaction reading it. I felt something heavier and more complicated, grief mostly, for the father I'd spent 31 years hoping might eventually show up at one of those dinners, and the understanding finally settling all the way into my bones that he never had been that man and never was going to be. But the consequences came anyway, whether I felt clean about them or not. Midwest Distribution Partners pulled Coleman Freight from consideration for the new contract within a week of the article, citing reputational concerns in a 2-line email Vanessa later told me my father read out loud to no one in his empty office, alone, on a Thursday afternoon. The Rotary Club quietly asked him to step down from the membership committee he'd chaired for 6 years. 2 of his longtime drivers, the ones my mother said he'd been trying to protect by rushing the Westerville deal in the first place, left within the month anyway, for a competitor that wasn't under an open state consumer protection inquiry. Bradley Ashford called off the engagement to Vanessa 9 days after the article ran. I don't know exactly what was said between them, and I've never asked my sister, because for the first time in longer than I can remember, she didn't call me to gloat about anything, and I understood that as its own kind of ending. My mother left him in February. I don't know if that would have happened without everything else. I think some marriages just run out of runway the way businesses do, quietly over decades, until one thing finally makes the runway visible. She calls me now most Sundays. She's met Noah for pancakes 3 times this spring, just the 2 of them, and last time he told me very seriously, over his own plate of pancakes, that Grandma Diane doesn't think Daddy is poor at all. She said Daddy's rich, he told me, in the ways that count. I didn't correct the grammar. I let it sit exactly the way he said it. Miller Automotive opened its 2nd location on Westerville Road the 2nd week of March, 14 bays. Frank Whitfield's old sign restored and hung by a sign shop. Eleanor insisted on paying for herself, over Daniel's objections, because she said it was the least she could do for the only person who'd told her the truth in 8 months. She comes by most Fridays now. Daniel keeps a chair in the corner of the front office that nobody else is allowed to sit in, and calls it Frank's chair, and Eleanor sits in it and drinks coffee and watches him work the way she used to watch her husband, and neither of them has ever once needed to explain that to me. My father still runs Coleman Freight, smaller now, 19 trucks instead of 41, a warehouse he's had to sublease half of to cover the note. I hear about him through my mother mostly, in the careful, factual way she's learned to talk about him since February, the way you'd describe weather you no longer have to stand in. He has not called me. I have not called him. I think about that empty chair at the head of his table sometimes, and I think about the one Daniel keeps in the corner of his shop for a man who's been dead 6 years and still shows up every day in the way his widow is treated. And I understand finally, at 31 years old, exactly what my father meant that night when he told me I'd regret what I'd thrown away. I don't. Not for one single morning. He built a company on 41 trucks and a father's co-signed loan, and somewhere along the way he decided that was the same thing as building a name worth trusting. It isn't. Trust doesn't come with a closing date. You don't get to lowball it for 8 years and then act shocked when nobody's willing to sign. Noah is 6 now. Last week he asked me, out of nowhere, buckling himself into his booster seat outside Frank's old shop, whether Grandpa Richard would ever come to his birthday party. I told him the truth, the way I'd promised myself I would after that Thanksgiving I never went back for. I don't know, baby. That's up to him. Okay, he said, and went back to his shoelaces because 6-year-olds have a mercy about these things that adults spend their whole lives trying to relearn. I watched him in the rearview mirror, safe and unbothered and utterly certain that his father is the richest man he knows. And I thought about the 5 words I'd said walking out of that house a year ago, the ones I meant as a warning, and that turned out, in the end, to be nothing more than the plain, unglamorous truth. He did regret it, just not in any of the ways he thought he would.